Alexander the Great, written by Ellen Williams. Focus question: how did Alexander the Great become a powerful leader? A prince is born in Macedonia. More than 2,300 years ago, a prince was born in the Greek state of Macedonia. The prince grew up to be a powerful king. Alexander the Great became known as the greatest leader the world had ever seen by conquering nations and kingdoms in lands near and far from Greece, not only through violent oppression, but also by forcing his culture on those he overpowered. Alexander was well educated and had developed a thirst for knowledge. Aside from wanting to grow his empire and gain power, some historians think that curiosity may have played a part in Alexander's drive to go farther than any Macedonian had gone before. His kingdom would include parts of Europe, Africa, and Asia. A leader in training. Alexander's story begins with his father, King Philip II. The title of king is usually handed down from father to son. Philip took the throne from his young nephew to become king of Macedonia. With a strong will and the support of a fierce army, Philip ensured that Macedonia and the surrounding Greek states were under his control. Alexander's mother, Olympias, was determined that her son would be king one day and that her position would be secured. Alexander's greatness was in large part due to having inherited a drive for power from both of his parents. He was also smart as a young boy. When he was 12 years old, his father refused to buy a beautiful but nervous horse. Alexander noticed that the horse was frightened by its own shadow. He calmed it down by turning its head away from the shadow. Alexander was able to control the horse and ride it easily. The horse, Bucephalus, was important to Alexander for the rest of his life. When Alexander was growing up, his father was often away, so Philip hired tutors and teachers to prepare his son to be king. Young noblemen of Greece learned to ride horses and hunt, as well as to fight with swords, javelins, and bows. Alexander and his boyhood friends would need to be well prepared for the fierce battles they were destined to fight. As Alexander grew older, he passed the Macedonian tests of manhood by killing a wild boar and killing a man in combat. As part of his education and training, Alexander studied with a philosopher named Aristotle. Respected for his knowledge, Aristotle helped Alexander understand and value culture and art. In addition to teaching him science, philosophy, history, politics, and ethics, Aristotle inspired Alexander's love of reading and of learning itself. Becoming king. The Persian Empire controlled much of Asia and was an enemy of Greece. Years before, Persia destroyed Greek cities in Asia Minor and took control of the area. Philip wanted to fight the Persians to regain control and conquer Asia. Alexander was still young when he began taking on leadership duties. At 16, he stopped a small revolution while Philip was away. Alexander commanded troops in some of his father's battles as a teenager. Alexander was raised to be king, but then Philip married another woman. Alexander's mother was not a pure Macedonian. If Philip had a baby with his new wife, a Macedonian, Alexander would not be the chosen heir. The new queen had a daughter in 336 BCE. Philip was killed soon after the baby was born. Not much later, Alexander's mother had the baby and her mother killed, leaving Alexander to become king. Alexander immediately rallied his father's army. Like his father, he wanted to conquer Asia, but he needed more than just a strong army. He also needed the people's support. Most Greek city-states supported Macedonia, but some had not approved of Philip. Now that his son was in charge, they were wary of him too. If they fought back, they could keep Alexander from ruling Greece and conquering Persia. Alexander managed to gain the support of many Greek states through persuasion, often accompanied by force. Some of the Greek states and territories around Macedonia still opposed Alexander and wanted to rebel, but his army crushed them. As a leader, Alexander was merciless, making an example of the rebels by killing them and selling others into slavery. This extreme punishment guaranteed submission of all the Greek city-states. A year after becoming king, Alexander was ready to expand Macedonian control beyond Greece. The journey begins. Alexander strengthened his troops with equipment, including body armor, shields, helmets, daggers, and enormous spears. He increased the number of cavalry and sent foot soldiers in a strong formation called a phalanx that would follow the cavalry and crush any enemy soldiers left standing. Alexander was a strong leader, able to share his vision and rally his troops. He led by example, always going into battle in front of his men and standing by them when things got rough. He had good instincts that allowed him to know how, when, and where to attack. Alexander left for Asia Minor, now Turkey, in the spring of 334 BCE. When he arrived, he boldly threw his spear into the ground, claiming the land for himself. The mighty phalanx. Thousands of Alexander's soldiers fought in tight groups in the phalanx formation. Each phalanx had about 16 rows of men. Soldiers carried spears that were often 6 meters, 20 feet, long. Soon after, Alexander had his first battle with the Persian army at the Granicus River. The Persian king, Darius III, was not there to lead. Both armies were well trained with foot soldiers and cavalry, but the Persians were less prepared and fell to the Macedonians. During the bloody hour-long battle, Alexander narrowly escaped death. Alexander's army moved on along the Aegean Sea, taking back Greek city-states and brutally fighting those who resisted. In 333 BCE, in the Battle of Issus, Alexander again met a larger Persian army, this time with Darius. The Persians still lost the hard-fought battle, although Darius escaped. Frustrated that he hadn't captured Darius, Alexander headed south to conquer the Persian fleet by capturing cities along the Mediterranean Sea, in what is today Syria and Lebanon. Some cities surrendered, but in 332 BCE, the city of Tyre resisted for 7 months before it was brutally defeated. With Tyre captured, Alexander continued along the Mediterranean coast and arrived in Egypt later in 332 BCE. The Persian ruler there stepped down. Alexander had respect for Egyptian religion and appointed Egyptian governors. Egypt welcomed him. After starting plans for the city of Alexandria, Alexander moved east toward other sections of the Persian Empire in Asia. Conquering Asia. Alexander traveled east of Asia Minor, Iraq, today, in 331 BCE, and met Darius in the Battle of Gaugamela. Darius had rebuilt his larger army, but Alexander's army overpowered them. Darius fled in defeat, along with much of his army. Alexander moved farther into the Persian Empire, conquering cities, exploring Persian ways, and trying to capture Darius. Before he could reach him, Darius was killed in 330 BCE by a man who Alexander later executed. Alexander was now considered king of Persia. Far from his home in Macedonia, Alexander started transforming his lifestyle to include Persian customs. He married two local princesses and began to expect Macedonians to honor him with low bows, as Persians did. Many Macedonians did not like Alexander's new behavior. Other soldiers followed Alexander's lead and married Persian women. Do you know? Most information about Alexander ultimately comes from one writer, a Greek named Callisthenes, who worked for Alexander. His stories cannot be accepted as absolute fact. Instead, it is important to consider how those who fought against Alexander might have told the same history. Callisthenes glosses over the consequences of war and Alexander's conquests. However, Callisthenes did not always view Alexander in the most positive light. The writer ultimately met an untimely death after disagreeing with Alexander. His army was exhausted, but Alexander managed to convince them to move farther east to what he knew as India, Pakistan, and Afghanistan today. In 326 BCE, Alexander fought Porus, a leader who resisted him. Alexander met Porus's troops at the Hydaspes River. Soldiers of this area used elephants in battle. Porus's elephants, having done some damage to the Greeks, eventually panicked due to the intensity of the fight and retreated. Porus surrendered to Alexander. It was Alexander's last big battle. There was great unrest among his soldiers. Unable to convince them to go any farther, he agreed to turn back. He made it to Babylon, where he came down with a fever in the spring of 323 BCE. He died there in June of that year. The legacy of Alexander. Alexander was undoubtedly a powerful man and an exceptional leader. His empire included parts of Europe, Asia, and Africa. Alexander was also savage. The number of people killed under his rule was close to 750,000. However, Alexander's conquests were not just about controlling people and land. He explored the history and customs of all the places he traveled. Alexander became a model for generations of leaders who followed. He opened doors of knowledge about the places he traveled and learned about new religions and governments. He also forced Greek ways upon those he conquered, setting the stage for future conquerors who took over lands and forced their cultures on indigenous peoples. While he is known as Alexander the Great, he certainly wasn't viewed that way by those he vanquished. In 15 years of conquest, Alexander never lost a battle. The world had never seen a military genius that matched Alexander's abilities. Connections. Writing. Pretend you are a Macedonian at the time Alexander the Great ruled. Write a journal entry about a day in your life. Research and include details about common jobs, religious practices, customs, or other parts of daily life. Social studies. Research to learn more about Darius III, king of Persia. Use a Venn diagram to compare and contrast Alexander the Great and Darius III.
Good job!